Along the fog-soaked Massachusetts coast, where the Atlantic winds carry the weight of forgotten sins, stands a weathered stone marker most people avoid. Fishermen cross themselves when they sail past it, and even seasoned historians refuse to say much about what it represents. Carved into the rock are only a year 1687 and two names, Ezekiel and Judith Harrington. For nearly 20 years, these siblings thrived on fear and accusation, building their wealth from the cries of the condemned and the seizure of their land. Their reign ended not with a trial, but with whispers of divine punishment. When their union produced twin children so malformed that doctors fled in horror, neighbors began to believe judgment had finally found them. The truth of what went on inside that remote manor, where 8-year-old children with twisted bodies and brilliant minds turned against their own parents, has remained buried in fear and rumor until now. Before we go deeper into the Harrington legacy, make sure to subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss stories like this, ones that others would rather erase from memory. Drop a comment with your city or state too, because these dark histories reach into every corner of America. The Harrington tale is not only about one family, but about how greed can rot the foundations of a whole community. In the 1660s, Massachusetts Bay Colony was gripped by religious zeal and constant struggle. Wickham's Harbor, a small settlement of barely 300, clung to survival through fishing, farming, and fear. The Puritan creed demanded constant watchfulness against Satan, and suspicion moved faster than fire through the pine forests. Ezekiel Harrington, at 28, had a sharp face and gray eyes that seemed to pierce through anyone he judged. His sister Judith, 25, shared his cold beauty and a tongue skilled at sowing doubt. Their father, a failed Boston merchant, had insisted they learn to read, write, and master the law of property. When he and their mother died in 1663, the siblings inherited nothing more than a farmhouse and debts. But instead of honest work, they found profit in hysteria. As witch-finders, they traveled to towns already strained by poor harvests or dead livestock. Ezekiel posed as an expert in signs of witchcraft, while Judith played the role of discerning assistant searching for hidden marks. Their first target was the widow Constance Fletcher, whose late husband had left her a grain mill coveted by rivals. Under the Harrington plan, she was accused of corrupting the harvest with unholy powers, and when they forced an examination, they secretly inflicted wounds that would later be presented as evidence of her pact with the devil. The testimony of neighbors sealed Constance Fletcher's fate. They swore they had seen her muttering strange words, coached skillfully by Judith's quiet suggestions and the fact that her mill kept producing flour when others had failed. Though really the result of good upkeep and location, was turned into proof of her supposed pact with the devil. On November 15th, 1664, Constance was hanged and her mill was carved up between the town and the Harringtons as payment. That first victim was only the beginning. Over the next 15 years, 8 different communities would fall under the siblings' shadow, and 57 innocent lives would be stolen through their schemes. Their decision to marry each other was born not of affection, but of calculation. Colonial law made such arrangements technically possible under certain circumstances, and to them it was the only way to protect their empire. By 1675, Ezekiel and Judith controlled assets worth more than £15,000, land mortgages, businesses, and detailed records of their crimes. If either married outside the family, their partner would gain rights to the fortune and perhaps access to the secrets that kept it hidden. If one died, inheritance law could scatter their holdings among distant kin, or let the colony claim them outright. Their answer was as cold as everything else they had done. In December 1675, during the winter solstice, they held a secret wedding in the manor's basement. The ceremony was officiated by a minister they had corrupted during a Salem witch trial witnessed only by two servants threatened into silence. To the world, they remained an unmarried brother and sister devoted to God's work, but in truth, they had tied themselves together legally to secure their wealth. Judith's pregnancy in 1676 seemed to confirm their confidence. At first it progressed normally, and they spared no expense in arranging for the best care. They brought in Sarah Whittam, a renowned Boston midwife, paid handsomely to live in their home, and supplied her with fine foods, imported medicines, and even mahogany cradles prepared for the heirs of their fortune. But as the months wore on, it became clear this was no ordinary birth. By the 7th month, Sarah noticed the unborn twins moving with an intensity she had never seen in more than 300 deliveries. The motions felt violent, coordinated, almost as though the children were locked in combat. She whispered to her assistant, Emma Prescott, that it seemed as if the twins were trying to harm each other inside the womb. Ezekiel brushed it off as superstition, but he was far from calm. He buried himself in medical texts from Boston, London, and Edinburgh, desperate for an explanation. The books confirmed that twin pregnancies often came with greater struggles and violent motion, but they also revealed something else, something darker. Children born of close kinship faced higher risks, stillbirth deformity, and mental affliction. Ezekiel's research both comforted and terrified him. There was still hope, but there was also the very real possibility that their careful plans would bring forth something cursed. The birth of the Harrington twins began on March 15, 1677, and dragged on for nearly 2 days, a nightmare that midwife Sarah Whittam would never forget. When the infants finally came into the world, the sight of them froze the women in the chamber. The boys were twisted in ways that defied natural law, limbs jutting at impossible angles. Skulls studded with unnatural bony ridges, torsos connected by thin bridges of flesh, and perhaps even shared organs. Yet it wasn't their grotesque appearance that left the strongest impression. It was the unmistakable awareness in their eyes. They grasped at objects, responded to movement, and exchanged strange sounds and gestures with each other that seemed deliberate, as though they were already holding conversations no one else could understand. Ezekiel and Judith, perhaps fearing rumors of demons, christened the boys with holy names Gabriel and Raphael, hoping the weight of Scripture would shield them. Against all odds, the children survived their harrowing birth and began to thrive in ways no one expected. By their first year, it was clear they were not ordinary. Their bodies grew weaker, more malformed, but their minds raced ahead. By 4, they were reading. By 5, they had mastered numbers. By 7, they were debating philosophy, like men trained at Cambridge. They had become something both extraordinary and unsettling, severely disabled children with the intellect of scholars. By their 8th birthday in 1685, the Harrington twins posed a danger their parents had not anticipated, hidden away in the manor, under the pretense of shielding them from public cruelty. The boys lived in shadows and silence, unseen by the world, but privy to everything within those walls. Ezekiel and Judith, convinced their children were too broken to comprehend, spoke freely in their presence, plotting, scheming, recounting past crimes, tallying profits from stolen land and blood-soaked trials. But Gabriel and Raphael absorbed it all, memorizing names, dates, methods. They knew their parents' empire was built on lies, bribery, and the systematic destruction of innocence. More chilling still, they pieced together the truth of their own existence, that their deformities were no curse from God, but the direct result of their parents' choice to marry and breed in secret to protect their fortune. This realization kindled something fierce in them, a cold, articulate hatred matched only by their determination to see justice done. That summer fate delivered them their first ally. Margaret Caldwell arrived at the manor, looking for work as a servant. She carried with her a quiet resilience born of tragedy for her father blacksmith. Thomas Caldwell had been hanged as a witch in 1679 after Ezekiel and Judith orchestrated his downfall to seize his forge and his prime property in Hadley's Crossing. Margaret had no idea she was walking into the very den of the people responsible for her family's ruin. But Gabriel and Raphael did. And for the first time, the boys saw a chance to turn their knowledge into action. Margaret entered the Harrington Manor with no suspicion that its masters were the very people who had destroyed her family. To her, they were wealthy and respected a chance at stability after years of hardship. But what she stumbled upon inside their walls would set into motion the most devastating witch trial scandal in colonial America. The twins reached out to her in ways that revealed both their brilliance and their desperation. Unable to speak clearly, they devised a secret system of communication, leaving carefully written notes in places Margaret would find while cleaning. At first, these notes pointed her toward hidden papers and strange financial records. But soon they grew into detailed instructions about where the real evidence of their parents' crimes was buried. The boys even learned to warn her about dangerous visitors, men and women, whose tempers and cruelties sometimes surpassed even those of Ezekiel and Judith. Their warnings saved Margaret from more than one encounter that could have cost her life. Everything changed in September 1685 when the twins revealed the existence of Ezekiel's most guarded secret, a false wall in his study, concealing ledgers that cataloged 15 years of murder for profit. These books contain payment records for each trial, inventories of stolen property, and precise costs of bribery witnesses and preparations. With this discovery, Margaret held proof that the Harringtons had orchestrated the deaths of dozens for money. But that proof came with peril. She knew if they suspected her, she would vanish like the others. Margaret chose a path both daring and careful. She copied the most damning documents in secret, then reached out to Father Benedict Thorne, a newly arrived Jesuit priest from France. Unlike most colonial officials, Thorne combined theological authority with sharp intellect and connections strong enough to challenge powerful figures. At first skeptical, he quickly realized the gravity of what Margaret showed him. The ledgers, the notations of threats and payments, even maps of confiscated land, all pointed to a criminal empire hiding under the cloak of piety. Thorne's background made him uniquely dangerous to the Harringtons. Where judges might ignore whispers of witchcraft and physicians might focus only on the grotesque children, Thorne recognized the spiritual and psychological rot that decades of cruelty left behind. He saw not demons, but the corruption of human will pushed to its limits by greed. In October 1685, he made his first visit to the manor under the guise of a routine pastoral call. Ezekiel and Judith welcomed him eagerly, thinking him another authority to charm and manipulate. They had done it countless times before. But Thorne was not easily fooled. From the moment he stepped through the door, he sensed the darkness saturating the house, not in supernatural forces, but in the heavy residue of violence and guilt. When he asked to meet the children, his words carried the tone of pastoral duty. In truth, he wanted to know if Gabriel and Raphael, those twisted but brilliant boys, were capable of bearing witness. He suspected already that they might hold the key to bringing down their parents' empire of blood. Margaret's notes had convinced Father Thorne that the Harrington twins knew far more than their parents imagined. But he needed to see for himself before risking their lives. When he was finally admitted into their chambers, What he found exceeded even the warnings he had been given. Gabriel and Raphael, their bodies broken and twisted in ways that caused them daily pain, revealed minds sharp enough to rival scholars. They spoke haltingly through gestures, scribbled notes and glances that carried meaning. Yet their thoughts showed clarity and depth that no one could mistake. Most striking of all, they displayed no fear of the priest, only relief, as though they had been waiting for someone with the strength to oppose their parents. They wasted no time trying to convey what they had seen, where evidence was hidden, and what crimes had been committed under their roof. Thorn, trained to minister to survivors of cruelty and persecution, recognized the same haunted mixture of suffering and hope he had once seen in adults scarred by torture. The tragedy here was sharper still. These were children trapped not just by their deformities, but by total dependence on the very monsters who had created them. When Father Thorn left the manor, the farewells were polite. But beneath the surface, both sides understood what had begun. The priest had seen enough to confirm his worst fears, while Ezekiel and Judith, sharp judges of character, sensed the danger in his probing eyes and careful questions. A silent war had been declared. Back in Boston, Thorn set the full machinery of the church into motion. Unlike the colonies, where justice bent easily under influence and bribes, the Catholic network had resources both administrative and covert. He gathered financial records pulled from colonial banks, interviewed grieving relatives, and within weeks compiled a devastating dossier. The crown jewel of his evidence came from Marcus Fletcher, a former accomplice who turned witness in exchange for protection. Fletcher admitted to planting evidence, bribing officials, and helping coach witnesses at the Harringtons' command. His confession laid bare the full machinery of their scheme, the targeting of wealthy widows and rivals, the staged discoveries of witch marks, and the handshakes behind closed doors that ensured verdicts of death. But Fletcher revealed something darker still. He testified that Ezekiel and Judith had not only married in secret to secure their fortune, but that they spoke openly about using their children as a grotesque source of profit planning to exhibit them privately to wealthy patrons hungry for curiosities of nature. The twins born from a union forged in greed were to be paraded as living anomalies, their suffering turned into entertainment for coin. With this revelation, Thorn's case shifted from one of greed and corruption to something even more damning. A portrait of human depravity so calculated it threatened the very moral foundations of the colony. Yet for all the records and testimonies, the most devastating weapon Thorn possessed against the Harringtons remained the children themselves, witnesses whose very existence exposed the depths of their parents' corruption and cruelty. Gabriel and Raphael, though only children, carried memories sharp enough to match any adult witness. They recalled voices, arguments, and decisions with such clarity that their words became the living proof needed to connect Ezekiel and Judith's ledgers to the real crimes committed. What made them impossible to dismiss was not just their recollection, but the moral weight behind it. These were not the ramblings of broken minds, but the testimony of two brilliant young souls who understood fully the evil around them. In secret visits arranged by Margaret Caldwell, Father Thorn interviewed the twins and uncovered horrors that even he had not anticipated. Ezekiel and Judith had not simply hidden their children from the world, they had treated them as tools in a grotesque experiment. The boys described years of suffering surgeries and examinations without anesthesia lessons, forced under the threat of starvation, and punishments designed to test how much pain and deprivation a child could endure. Ezekiel and Judith's obsession was not just wealth, but knowledge twisted into cruelty. They meticulously documented every stage of their son's growth, intending to sell the findings to European scholars fascinated by the effects of inbreeding and deformity. By the end of 1685, the Harrington Empire was straining under pressure from all sides. Father Thorn had gathered enough evidence to expose them, yet he walked a knife's edge. Any rash move might drive the siblings to destroy their children, Margaret or other witnesses, before justice could strike. Meanwhile, Gabriel and Raphael were no longer passive victims. Using their confinement as cover, they devised ingenious ways to record conversations, observations, and plans, hiding caches of notes that describe their parents' ongoing schemes. Their courage, born of intellect and desperation, became the quiet engine driving the case against Ezekiel and Judith. But the Harringtons were not fools. They began to sense the shift in their household, the subtle signs that their children were no longer fully under their control. Suspicion bred paranoia, and where most parents might have shown concern or even pride, Ezekiel and Judith felt only fear. To them, Gabriel and Raphael's awakening was not a miracle, but a threat. The breaking point came in early December 1685. Ezekiel, performing his ritual inspection of the study, noticed disturbances that set his blood cold. Fine scratches along the false wall hinges. Worn by more than his own hands, dust unsettled where none should have been. Someone had found the hidden compartment. Worse, the intruder had gone straight for the most damning ledgers, the very heart of his criminal secrets. For the first time in years, Ezekiel Harrington knew what it meant to feel hunted. The hidden ledgers told their own story pages marked with faint pencil dots around passages on bribery, intimidation, and property fraud. These subtle notations revealed a careful reader who had studied the records in detail. Ezekiel's suspicion fell quickly on Margaret Caldwell, whose role in the household made her an obvious suspect. Dragged before them, Margaret endured the same interrogations Ezekiel and Judith had inflicted on their witch trial victims. She admitted to knowing far too much. But under pressure, it became clear she could not have engineered every breach of security. The siblings, blinded by arrogance, never once considered the unthinkable, that their own children had turned against them. To Ezekiel and Judith, Gabriel and Raphael were helpless, twisted bodies with sharp minds locked behind dependence. They could not imagine the boys as threats. That blindness was their undoing. While suspicion fell on Margaret and Father Thorn, the twins carried on with their clandestine work, building a case piece by piece. They communicated in ways no adult suspected. Coded scratches, hidden notes, subtle sounds that meant nothing to others, but everything to them. Their disabilities had forced them into brilliance, sharpening observation and memory, until they could track conversations, record movements, and piece together strategies with precision. By mid-December 1685, their evidence had grown staggering. They had not only cataloged their parents' past crimes, but also uncovered plans for the future and expansion into the Connecticut River Valley, where fear of Indian raids could be twisted into accusations of witchcraft. More chilling still, the boys discovered their own names, spoken in hushed tones as liabilities. Ezekiel and Judith had begun to discuss convenient accidents, disabled children lost to the cold, claimed by illness, buried quietly before spring. The preparations were unmistakable. Faced with this, the twins did not panic. They turned to strategy. They would not flee nor merely whisper warnings to Father Thorn. Instead, they resolved to beat their parents at their own game, to construct a trap that would force Ezekiel and Judith to reveal themselves in front of witnesses with the power to bring justice. They knew their chances of survival were slim, but if their deaths ensured the truth was revealed, it would be a worthy sacrifice. The day they chose carried its own weight, December 21st, 1685, the winter solstice, the same date a decade earlier when their parents had sealed their secret union. On that night, Gabriel and Raphael prepared to set the stage for the confrontation that would either end in their destruction or bring the Harrington Empire crashing down forever. December 21st, 1685, was not just another winter solstice in Massachusetts. It marked the 10th anniversary of Ezekiel and Judith Harrington's secret wedding, a night they honored every year, with a private ritual that laid bare the full scope of their depravity. To them, it was not a celebration of love, but of partnership in power and blood, a commemoration of the empire they had built through fear and death. To Gabriel and Raphael, it was the one night when their parents' arrogance made them careless, and it provided the perfect stage for the trap they had been planning in silence. The twins had spent weeks preparing for this night, with a patience and precision that seemed impossible for children their age. They had hidden caches of copied documents, maps of stolen properties, and written testimonies describing what they had seen and heard. They had even turned their keen minds to sabotage weakening specific beams and floorboards of the manor itself, crafting tools from scraps and studying their parents' architectural books until they understood how to bend wood and stone to their will. Their plan was a masterwork of desperation and genius, the kind of design only children forced to survive in shadows could imagine. Meanwhile, Ezekiel and Judith prepared for their anniversary with the confidence of predators who believed themselves untouchable. They had spent the day counting their profits, reviewing the names of those they had condemned, and planning their departure from Massachusetts for the Carolinas, where they intended to reinvent themselves before suspicion could follow. As night fell, the atmosphere inside the manor grew heavy, a mix of greed and malice that clung to the walls like smoke. In the chamber below, Gabriel and Raphael lay in wait, listening to the voices above, as they had done every year, only this time, with the knowledge that justice was on its way. Father Thorn did not come alone. His pastoral visit was a cover for a carefully orchestrated operation that had taken weeks to prepare. He had walked the grounds, studied the building's layout, and devised escape routes with military precision. His background as a chaplain during Europe's wars had given him both tactical skill and the iron will needed for what lay ahead. With him came not only colonial officials armed with warrants, but physicians ready to care for the children, legal clerks to seize and catalog evidence, and even an engineer prepared for the structural dangers of a collapsing house. This would be no ordinary raid. It was a rescue, an intervention, and a reckoning rolled into one. The moment had to be flawless. One misstep and the Harringtons would vanish into the night, leaving more death in their wake. For Father Thorn, for Margaret Caldwell, and most of all, for Gabriel and Raphael, there would be no second chance. The night of December 21st was the night the Harrington Empire would either fall or claim its final victims. When Father Thorn rapped on the door of Harrington Manor at exactly 7 o'clock, the siblings were in the midst of their most private ritual. Their 10th anniversary celebration surrounded by the ledgers, jewels, and victim lists that laid bare their empire of blood. At first, Ezekiel and Judith reacted with the same irritated confidence that had carried them through countless interrogations before. They had outwitted ministers, magistrates, and town elders for over 20 years. They assumed this priest would be no different. Yet as Thorn explained his visit, concern for Margaret Caldwell's welfare, the offer of prayers in the cold season, a pastoral duty, their unease began to grow. His tone was too steady, his questions too precise, and his knowledge of their affairs too deep for mere chance. The decisive moment came when Father Thorn asked to see Gabriel and Raphael. The siblings' instinct was to deny him, with their usual excuse that the boys were too fragile for visitors, but both recognized that refusal might raise suspicions they could not afford. Against their better judgment, they agreed, not realizing they had just walked into the snare their children had so carefully prepared. Inside the chamber, with Ezekiel and Judith looming nearby, the priest gave the prearranged signal. The twins responded instantly, straining against their broken voices, but with unshakable precision. Gabriel began. On the night of September 14th, 1679, our father and mother met with Marcus Fletcher in the cellar to plan the accusation of Thomas Caldwell. Mother gave Fletcher silver coins taken from Rebecca Whitmore's jewelry. Father instructed him on where to hide the puppet that would be discovered during the barn search. Without hesitation, Raphael took up the testimony. The puppet contained hair cut from Caldwell's youngest daughter during a false examination. Fletcher placed it beneath the anvil in the forge, exactly where the witnesses had been told to look. The words cut like knives. For the first time in decades, Ezekiel and Judith's composure faltered. To hear their most intimate secrets echoed back to them by the children they had dismissed as broken and harmless shattered their confidence. They had prepared for inquisitors, for rivals, even for betrayal among accomplices, but not for treachery from the mouths of their own offspring. And the revelations did not stop. Gabriel and Raphael spoke in turns, recounting not only past murders, but also hidden caches of stolen goods, the bribery networks that had shielded their parents, and even killings that had been covered so thoroughly no one had ever suspected foul play. Raphael's voice grew stronger as hope steadied him. Beneath the study's eastern floorboards lies a chest containing 37 pieces of jewelry stolen from executed women, including the wedding ring of Mary Hutchkins, hanged in 1681. Father poisoned his own cow and claimed her curse had killed it. Her farm and tools were taken and divided between the treasury and our parents. Piece by piece, the twins dismantled the empire Ezekiel and Judith had built. Each word a stone pulled from the foundation until the whole structure trembled. And in that moment, in the very house where so many innocent lives had been plotted against the Harrington siblings, realized the truth, they had finally been outmaneuvered, not by magistrates or ministers, but by the very children they had underestimated all their lives. The weight of Gabriel and Raphael's testimony was undeniable. Their words, delivered with precision and bolstered by their keen intelligence and broken bodies, carried the authority of lived truth. Every claim they made was matched by records corroborating witnesses and evidence Father Thorne's team had painstakingly gathered. No official could dismiss the boys as delusional. Their condition only underscored the monstrous nature of their parents' crimes. For Ezekiel and Judith, exposure brought no moment of remorse. They showed no flicker of human concern for their children, no plea for forgiveness, not even fear of damnation. Instead, they fell back on calculation. First, they tried to discredit the testimony, dismissing their sons as unstable minds, twisted by deformity. But the effort collapsed as Thorne laid before them copied ledgers, notarized witness statements, and physical proof that perfectly matched the children's revelations. Denial was no longer possible. Cornered, the Harringtons turned to their final card, the emergency plan designed long ago for this very moment. Hidden pistols, escape passages, and caches of money lay scattered through the manor, prepared to buy silence and secure their flight into the wild territories beyond colonial law. The eruption of violence was as quick as it was savage. Yet what Ezekiel and Judith had not realized was that their children had already accounted for this. Months of observation had given Gabriel and Raphael full knowledge of their parents' emergency measures. They had devised counter-traps with the patience of clockmakers, their fragile hands working in secret, turning weakness into strategy. When Ezekiel drew a concealed pistol and aimed at Father Thorne, the weapon burst apart in his grip. For weeks, Gabriel had been slipping tiny fragments of metal into the barrel. The explosion tore open Ezekiel's hand, leaving him bleeding and incapable of resistance. Judith fared no better. With a knife drawn from beneath her gown, she lunged at the nearest official, only to crash through a floorboard Raphael had deliberately weakened. The impact crippled her, and as she fell, the mechanism the twins had designed triggered collapsing supports that sealed doors and windows with debris. The manor itself had become a cage, locking the predators inside with the evidence of their sins. In the end, the siblings who had spent 2 decades trapping others were undone by the very children they had underestimated. Gabriel and Raphael had turned their parents' obsession with control into the means of their downfall, ensuring that escape was no longer possible, and that justice at long last would be unavoidable. The showdown in the manor's main hall unfolded with the precision of a play Gabriel and Raphael had rehearsed in their minds for months. Every weakened beam, every loosened joint, every carefully measured flaw in the structure was designed to channel destruction in just the right way. When Ezekiel and Judith found themselves trapped escape routes, sealed weapons sabotaged, they turned at last on the children, determined to silence them forever. But the twins had prepared for this moment above all others. At their signal, the manor itself became their weapon. The supports gave way in a controlled collapse that thundered through the hall. The floor split, timbers groaned, and in seconds the building that had loomed as their prison came crashing down. Just as they had calculated, the destruction pinned Ezekiel and Judith beneath crushing beams, while leaving Father Thorn, the officials, and the twins sheltered in a pocket of stability. What might have been a massacre became instead a perfect act of justice. The collapse did more than kill the Harringtons. It stripped their secrets bare. Hidden rooms cracked open, spilling out ledgers, jewels, and grim trophies. Concealed chests revealed not only wealth, but skeletal remains, victims who had never been accounted for their deaths buried in silence until the walls themselves gave testimony. For Gabriel and Raphael, the falling of the manor was both literal and symbolic. The prison that had confined them for 8 long years was gone, torn down by their own courage and intellect. Rescuers pulled survivors from the debris hours later, finding the twins battered and exhausted, but alive. Ezekiel and Judith lay dead in the wreckage, their final expressions twisted in disbelief that the children they had dismissed as helpless had brought about their end. Gabriel and Raphael, despite their injuries, immediately pressed on with their mission. They continued offering testimony, eager to ensure that every victim's story was told and every crime laid bare. Their survival alone was a rebuke to their parents' cruelty, proof that resilience and moral clarity could flourish even in the harshest soil. The aftermath shook Massachusetts to its core. The evidence unearthed in the ruins, combined with the boys' meticulous recollections, left no room for doubt. The colony had to face a terrible truth that its courts had been used as weapons by predators cloaked in piety. Within days, colonial judges issued posthumous convictions against Ezekiel and Judith Harrington on 57 counts of murder, along with charges of bribery, fraud, judicial corruption, and conspiracy. It was the largest reckoning of its kind in colonial history, and its ripples reached far beyond the manor's ashes. Procedures for witchcraft, accusations grew stricter. Communities became more suspicious of those who profited from fear, and whispers spread that the Harrington case had only been the most visible tip of a much darker iceberg. Yet even in that shadow, one truth endured: 2 broken children had toppled the empire of blood their parents had built, proving that justice, though delayed, could still rise from ruin. The Harrington case reverberated across the colonies, etched into history as the most thorough and far-reaching criminal prosecution of its time. Scholars later cited it as the turning point when colonial law began confronting not just individual crimes, but entire systems of corruption. The evidence was overwhelming, the scope staggering. Ezekiel and Judith were posthumously condemned, but the repercussions did not end with their deaths. Father Benedict Thorne's investigation had unearthed more than one family's empire of blood. The record's testimonies and financial trails revealed webs of complicity that extended deep into the colonial courts themselves. Judges, clerks, and ministers had profited from the trade, in fear-bending trials into tools for theft. The Harrington downfall forced a reckoning. Colonial assemblies launched full-scale reviews of witch trial procedures across New England. What they found confirmed the darkest suspicions. Systematic abuse of supernatural accusations was not unique to one household, but a pattern that had poisoned entire communities. This revelation fueled growing doubt about witch trials as a whole and hastened the reforms that within a generation would bring an end to organized persecution by accusation of witchcraft. The economic aftermath was equally profound. The Harrington fortune, estimated at more than £25,000, was dismantled piece by piece. Special legal commissions worked for 3 years to trace stolen assets, restore farmland, shops, and mills to families who had been ruined decades earlier. It was the first large-scale restitution process in colonial America, and it exposed just how meticulously the Harringtons had documented their empire. From maps marking seized estates to lists of bribed officials and projections for expansion into the Carolinas, their records provided chilling insight into crime elevated to corporate scale. Amid this upheaval, the survival of Gabriel and Raphael offered a stark counterpoint to their parents' legacy. Dr. William Harvey, a royal physician summoned from London to study their condition, found that much of their supposed helplessness had been manufactured. Years of deliberate neglect and psychological manipulation had kept them dependent. With proper food, medicine, and therapy, their progress was astonishing. The twisted limbs remained, but strength and mobility improved. More striking still was the flowering of their minds. Freed from isolation, the twins devoured books, outpaced adults in mathematics, and revealed artistic talents that drew admiration from scholars. Dr. Harvey's reports, compiled over the twins' first years of freedom, became foundational in the emerging study of medical psychology. His case notes argued that disability did not equate to intellectual deficiency, and that with care and education, extraordinary potential could emerge from even the most difficult circumstances. Gabriel and Raphael, once hidden as family shame, became living proof of resilience and possibility. Their testimony remained central to the trials that followed, ensuring that every life destroyed by their parents was honored in the record. But their greater legacy lay beyond the courtroom. They embodied the triumph of truth over manipulation, of intellect over cruelty, and of justice over a system built on fear. The Harrington Empire had crumbled into dust, yet from its ruins rose a story that changed how colonies saw law, disability, and the dangerous price of unchecked greed. Gabriel and Raphael's testimony did more than topple their parents' empire. It became the cornerstone of prosecutions against dozens of surviving accomplices. Their detailed recollections of the conversations, schemes, and names matched perfectly with ledgers and documents recovered from the ruins, leaving judges and juries with no doubt about the scale of corruption. Yet beyond the hard evidence, it was their presence, two young men of brilliant minds and unshakable moral clarity, that made them unforgettable witnesses. No one who heard them could dismiss their words as inventions. Dr. William Harvey's evaluations only deepened that impression. Against all expectations, the twins showed no signs of permanent psychological damage, despite years of isolation, manipulation, and pain. They carried scars, yes, but their core remained astonishingly whole, calm, ethical, and resilient. This strength carried them as they stepped into the world outside Harrington Manor. At first, many looked on them with curiosity, even fear. But those feelings melted when people encountered their intelligence, kindness, and dignity. The twins soon became living proof that society's harsh judgments of physical difference were deeply misguided. That transformation of perception had lasting consequences. Gabriel and Raphael showed colonial America that ability, not appearance, defined human worth. Their lives became arguments for inclusion education and opportunity concepts that would ripple outward into broader social change. Adulthood brought new chapters just as remarkable as their survival. Gabriel pursued law, becoming a respected scholar whose writings reshaped colonial jurisprudence. His essays on evidence corruption and the protection of vulnerable witnesses influenced courts for generations. Drawing directly from his childhood ordeal, he championed reforms that created safeguards for child witnesses and individuals with disabilities, ensuring their voices could not be silenced or manipulated as his parents had once attempted. Raphael, by contrast, turned toward medicine. As a physician, he focused on children with physical differences and survivors of abuse, pioneering an approach that saw patients not as broken bodies, but as full human beings deserving dignity and integration. His most enduring achievement was the founding of the first school in the colonies dedicated to educating children with disabilities. Under his guidance, the school became a model for what society could achieve when it invested in rather than hid away its most vulnerable. His philosophy that every person carries potential and that it is society's duty to nurture it challenged deep prejudices and inspired similar institutions across New England. Both brothers built families of their own, their children untouched by the shadows of their past. The genetic curse that had been the price of Ezekiel and Judith's unholy union ended, with them leaving a new generation free of both deformity and corruption. In this, Gabriel and Raphael achieved the final triumph over their parents' legacy. They not only survived the darkness, but ensured that it would never return in their bloodline. From victims hidden in a prison of wood and stone, the twins became leaders whose work reshaped law, medicine, and education. Their lives proved that resilience can be stronger than cruelty. The truth can rise even from ruins, and that justice once awakened can echo for generations. The legacy of Gabriel and Raphael Harrington reached far beyond their survival, their testimony, or even their remarkable professional achievements. Their greatest triumph was perhaps the simplest, yet most profound. They built homes filled with love, stability, and trust. After enduring 8 years of manipulation and cruelty, their ability to form healthy marriages and raise children free of fear showed that trauma did not have to dictate destiny. With proper support, healing was not only possible, but transformative. This truth reshaped how colonial society thought about family childhood and the lasting impact of abuse. The Harrington case became a touchstone for scholars, ministers, and physicians studying child development. Gabriel and Raphael stood as living proof that resilience could flourish when victims were given compassion, education, and care. Their recovery and success challenged fatalistic views about the permanence of early suffering and offered hope that cycles of abuse could be broken. The investigation itself carried equal weight in shaping the future. Father Benedict Thorne's meticulous methods, protecting vulnerable witnesses, gathering layered evidence, and documenting every stage, became a blueprint for how to pursue justice against entrenched power. His approach influenced colonial courts, religious orders, and later generations of law enforcement, embedding the idea that even the most powerful could be held accountable if the truth was methodically preserved. His writings on the Harrington affair became required reading in seminaries and law schools, a grim but vital lesson on how corruption festers when oversight fails. The site of Harrington Manor, once a place of terror, was consecrated as a memorial. Colonial leaders decreed the ruins should remain untouched, a stark reminder of what happens when fear and greed eclipse reason and morality. Funds seized from the Harrington fortune were used to preserve the ground, transforming it into an educational site where future generations could confront the dangers of unchecked authority and the necessity of protecting the vulnerable. At its heart stands a stone marker. Unlike the cold slab the siblings had once erected to celebrate their power, this one bears an inscription chosen by the very children they had tried to destroy. Gabriel and Raphael's words endure in the carved letters. Here lies the house that fear built and the truth that brought it down. Let justice remember the innocent, and let no voice be silenced by cruelty again. That marker still stands today, a quiet but unflinching memorial to the darkness of the Harringtons and the extraordinary resilience of the children who destroyed them. Here lies the truth. Evil is not the work of spirits or demons, but of ordinary people who choose greed over conscience. The Harrington case proved that justice is sustained only by those who refuse to remain silent in the face of wrongdoing. Most importantly, it showed that children, regardless of their bodies or their social station, carry an innate dignity and moral agency that must be honored and protected. Gabriel and Raphael shattered every assumption of their age. Dependent on the very parents who abused them, they nonetheless found the courage to expose crimes that powerful adults had ignored or even profited from. Their bravery became one of the earliest arguments for children's rights, influencing how colonial society and later America itself viewed protection, education, and the responsibility to safeguard vulnerable lives. Their story challenged deep prejudices about disability, proving that intellectual brilliance and moral clarity can flourish even in those dismissed as weak or broken. The Harrington legacy continues to echo because it forces us to confront a hard truth. Communities can become complicit in evil when fear and superstition overwhelm reason and compassion. Ezekiel and Judith thrived not because they were supernatural monsters, but because they mastered the art of manipulation, pitting neighbors against one another, weaponizing suspicion, and profiting from the machinery of fear. Their empire endured nearly 2 decades because too many chose silence over courage. And yet, their downfall was equally human. It came not from divine judgment, but from the determination of children, a servant, and a priest who would not be intimidated into silence. The lesson endures in justice, survives only when people allow it to, but it collapses when even the most unlikely voices speak with truth and resolve. What do you think, were the Harringtons unique, or were there others across colonial America who turned witchcraft hysteria into profitable murder? How many so-called acts of God might have been nothing more than carefully calculated crimes? Share your theories in the comments, and if this tale chilled you, make sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next story. In our next video, we'll uncover another case of colonial evil, one so grim that most would rather leave it buried in the shadows of history. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.